It's hard to believe that is not a real RCMP cruiser.
In April of 2020, Canada underwent the worst mass shooting in its history, in which some fucking goof impersonating a police officer went on a 13-hour rampage in Nova Scotia, killing 22 people and injuring 3 others. Several of the victims died in house fires set by the perpetrator, but the main focus has been on the firearms he used. Now, many of the victims could have been saved if the police had just been forwarded with the information that the perp was dressed as a cop, but that's not what this video is about. This video is about the aftermath in which Justin Trudeau's Liberal cabinet passed an order to ban assault-style sports rifles, and the backlash from the gun lobby Conservatives. On May 1st, the government reclassified them as prohibited under the Firearms Act, with a 2-year amnesty period for owners to trade them in for cash or apply for their ownership to be grandfathered in. I think natives might be exempt as well, but the prohibition applies to over 1,500 firearms, some of which I have to admit have a questionable place on that list, but it's largely semi-automatic rifles and those used in previous mass shootings that are targeted. Some of the arguments I've heard against the move thus far have been pretty piss poor. They mostly revolve around liberty without any social responsibility. Hey, and I'm all for liberty, but one has to take into account real-world utilitarian outcomes as well as your deontological principles. And one of the funniest parts of this debate is the strange dichotomy when you're talking to gun nuts, and out of one side of their mouth they claim that assault-style sport rifles are no different than any other long guns available on the market. Which is generally true. You can find other rifles with similar caliber, muzzle velocity, rate of fire, and whatnot, but not typically all in the same convenient lightweight package. But then on the other side of their mouth, they claim that they need these sports rifles for hunting hogs and fighting off tyrannical government. So which is it? Either it's the same as other rifles and just cosmetically different, therefore functionally redundant and you don't need it, or it is superior and thus is part of why mass shooters prefer to use them. There's also a psychological aspect to it. Pretend militants with delusions of grandeur who want to play Rambo gravitate towards these type of faux military firearms. Obviously not everyone who buys them fits that bill, but it clearly does appeal heavily to that demographic. People who just want to feel cool when they hold it. Gun manufacturers know this. That's why sport rifles were invented in the first place. Gun sales had slumped and they needed a way to invigorate their demographic. So in the 1960s they got the idea to start modding military designs to sell to the public, so the average American could pretend to play Army Man at home. Then in 1994, American politicians realized it was kind of a dumb idea to let every Joe Blow have one, so they instituted the federal assault weapons ban. Didn't have a very large effect, due mostly to giant loopholes, and the fact that America has an obsessive gun culture problem in the first place, but studies done in 2015 show a decrease in mass shootings during that time, and an uptick when the ban ended. Now, conservatives will point at the American assault weapons ban and claim it wasn't very effective, but how many lives need to be saved before it's worth it? And statistics show that every other nation that enacts regulations has seen a vast reduction in shootings. Australia, Japan, the UK, Germany. So although results may vary, they typically trend towards a reduction. So how are these gun nuts going to argue that having their pretend Rambo toys is worth an uptick in mass shootings? How are you going to argue that a reduction in dead citizens, even if it's as little as 2 a year, isn't worth anything, when it literally only comes at the expense of what you ostensibly claim is a cosmetic difference in your firearm? Like, I would understand if it was all the guns they were taking, like Eritrea, but it's just a certain classification of guns. They use the argument that legal law-abiding owners shouldn't be punished for what criminals do, but for starters, this isn't a punishment. They aren't taking them away as a punitive measure. It's a preventative measure, one that statistically bears out. You can argue all sorts of principles about how you should be able to keep it since you've been a good boy with it, or how there are other things you can do to help the gun problem, but none of that really negates what the numbers show. It's a better measure than not. And no matter how much I promise I'm going to be responsible with it, the government won't let me build a nuclear bomb. Also keep in mind that James Holmes was a law-abiding, responsible gun owner right up until he wasn't and he shot up a theater. Secondly, in 1988, the government banned lawn darts because a few kids in Canada were injured and one kid in the States died. Nobody marched on Capitol Hill to protest the right to throw lawn darts in the fucking air. All mature adults acknowledged that this was a risk that wasn't worth the benefit. Yeah, some kids died, but in my defense, I like lawn darts. Like, I'm sorry, that isn't a compelling argument. We used to drive around without seatbelts too, but then we passed a law. And you can bitch about how they impeded your liberty, but overall seatbelts were an undeniably good idea and saved 15,000 lives a year, without much of a detriment. And I know I'm being a little flippant about it, but it's not so cut and dry, because I am an advocate of liberty, and people should be able to own whatever they like within reason. But the precedent has already been set that there are already all sorts of armaments that you're not allowed to own. Even a conservative like Justice Scalia, in a very gun-permissive culture like the United States, admitted that there are limits on the Second Amendment and that it is reasonable to restrict certain firearms. We have no guaranteed right to firearms. It's just a privilege up here in Canada. And we've been getting along pretty well so far without any of the crazy shit Americans have access to. Well, anyway, I came across this post on Facebook claiming it was written by a 16-year-old, which I could believe because it utilizes the logic of a child. But I know most of these memes are written by old conservatives posing as hip young go-getters anyway, so let's take a look.
I believe that the supposed assault weapons ban is ridiculous and amounts to little more than pandering to uneducated voters in a time of hypersensitivity and fear. The logic for this ban seems to rest on a few ill-conceived and fundamentally flawed principles.
Sure, some of it might be pandering, but the Liberals openly said that they were going to do this back when they were elected. It was a campaign promise, so they had this in the works long before the Nova Scotia shooting, if that's what he's implying. I've heard other posts in which people suggest Trudeau used emergency powers granted during the COVID-19 outbreak to pass this by fiat, but that's not true either. They always had the authority to do this, and they actually postponed it because of the virus. The Nova Scotia shooting just jump-started it again. They'll claim it's an abuse of authority, but banning firearms can legally be done by an order in council by the cabinet and does not require legislation. Sorry, but that's how the system works. If you have a problem with order in council, then why were you all so quiet when Conservative PM Stephen Harper passed over 24 OICs in complete secret? I agree that representative democracy isn't particularly democratic, but even if this was a direct democracy, the motion would have still passed because according to polls, 4 out of 5 Canadians support the measure. Both the NDP and the Bloc Québécois backed the Liberals up on it, so it's far-fetched to believe that those poll numbers don't reflect reality. Even if the poll was inaccurate and it was only 3 out of 5 Canadians, that's still a majority. You'd lose the firearms either way. To be fair, I can see a few problems with this being rolled out so quickly, both in some of the firearms erroneously added to the list, some of the glaring absences from the list, like the WK-180C, and the lack of details on the buyback program. But overall, I am not opposed to adding semi-automatic, military-inspired sport rifles to the list of prohibited firearms. I don't see how anyone is particularly harmed so long as the government can fairly compensate you for the trade-in.
The logic for this ban seems to rest on a few ill-conceived and fundamentally flawed principles. That these weapons were designed to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. This is demonstrably false. Only a very small percentage of the banned firearms were created for military use. The AR-15, for example, is a civilian version of the M16 that does not possess the same capabilities. Furthermore, Canada already enacts very strict magazine capacity limits of 5 rounds for said rifles. So the idea that these are military-style weapons is not just a misrepresentation, it's a flat-out lie.
First, he moves the goalposts and switches the premise halfway through his sentence. He starts with the claim that the assault-style rifles weren't designed to kill people quickly and efficiently. And although no sane firearms manufacturer would overtly admit their civilian guns are made for killing people, the fact is it can kill quickly and efficiently, and that is the problem. I mean, just look at the Armalite website. The first uses listed are duty, followed by home defense. Now, what do you think they mean by duty? Kidd pointed out himself that these aren't military issue and they aren't brought to the front lines by soldiers, so clearly they don't mean in the line of duty in any official capacity. Duty in this case is code for shooting people. Home defense is also code for shooting people. This rifle's primary function is shooting people, and sports shooting is listed as the tertiary use. Secondly, the fact that it isn't used by the military doesn't denote that it's not for primarily killing things quickly and efficiently. They're pretty much all based on military rifles and then nerfed just enough to make them legal. Some of them are pretty much indistinguishable, save for barrel length and the lack of fully automatic fire, which can be pretty easily modified. There are all sorts of accessories too that increase its capabilities, pushing it further and further towards lethality. So it's not a misrepresentation really to claim that these are military-style weapons, as the manufacturers outright admit that they are modeled after military rifles. He conflates military style with military issue or use.
Nobody needs an AR-15 to take down a deer. There is quite a lot wrong with this statement. Firstly, we in Canada are not permitted to hunt with restricted firearms, something you might think a Prime Minister would be aware of.
Well, I'm sure he is aware, which is why he didn't say anything about the legality of shooting a deer with a restricted firearm. He just said that you don't need one to accomplish that task, which is 100% true and accurate as far as I can tell. Same goes with the stupid wild boar argument. People were hunting boar before sports rifles ever hit the market. Real hunters will admit that there are plenty of other guns you can use to hunt boar. Even a bolt action like a Winchester Model 70 will do.
If we were in fact allowed to hunt with the AR-15, I have no doubt not many people would use it for deer, as most people prefer a more powerful caliber. Other than that, the AR-15 remains a very popular rifle for hunting all kinds of smaller game, such as wild boars, for example, or coyotes.
Oh, look at that, he brought up the wild boar thing. Except unlike most gun nuts I talk to, he actually downplays how tough and dangerous they are and calls them small game. Funny how it's like Schrodinger's boar. It's both immensely powerful and incredibly weak at the same time, depending on whatever argument helps bulwark your point.
An argument I encounter quite often is nobody needs a semi-automatic rifle to hunt. One good reason to use a semi-auto for hunting is to allow for a quick follow-up shot with no manipulation of the firearm required, which keeps you on target and raises your chances for bagging your animal. If you ever happen to encounter an angry bear or mountain lion, you might be glad you had a semi-auto as well.
Cool, but didn't you just finish telling me that sports rifles don't even have the caliber necessary to take down a deer? Now it's going to save me from a grizzly or a cougar? Why does this firearm magically scale up and down in lethality depending on the argument he's making? And quite frankly, if you need a second shot to put down your target, you're not that great a hunter, and maybe you should find a new hobby. I'm surprised he didn't just go with the classic, we need them to fight government tyranny line. I gotta say, in this day and age, your sports rifle pea shooters aren't gonna do shit against the government. They have tanks and helicopters and drones and satellites, and you've got mock military rifles, which you probably only ever shot at a target range. It's not enough for a clean kill on a buck, but it's gonna somehow stop the tyranny of the federal government. The gun is all things to all people, apparently. And the real paranoiacs out there think this is a ploy to disarm the population. But it seems to me there are still plenty of firearms available to you. It's a slippery slope to say that if they take your Bushmaster, the next will be left with bows and arrows. That's a bridge we can cross when we get there. And to retread an old point, a bunch of fat, poorly trained militiamen aren't going to put a dent in a modern military anyway. People try and cite Vietnam or the American War of Independence as an example of allegedly successful asymmetrical warfare. By any realistic measure, America came out on top in Vietnam, and the only reason America gained independence is because the nearest central authority was 4,500 miles across the sea. Vietnam was never about occupation, or even stopping communism either. Something like 58,000 American soldiers died compared to over 1 million estimated Viet Cong, and that was overseas in a country where you had no real business being in the first place. You really think the American or Canadian government would allow an insurrection on domestic soil? This is their home base, and they have much more motivation to hold on to power here than in any foreign nation. If you took up arms against them, you'd just be labeled a terrorist group. You'd give them justification to use force against you. You are effectively already disarmed. The age of overt armed rebellion may be over. The overt show of force is the old way. Modern problems require modern solutions. If we ever have to dismantle the government, we'd have to hit them in the money supply. And the most effective way to do that would be withdrawing your labor.
Since we are discussing needs versus wants, does anybody really need a BMW with 400 horsepower? Does anybody need a mansion with 20 bedrooms? Does anybody need a private jet? Does anybody need a samurai sword hanging on their wall? I mean, a samurai sword is a weapon of war that if someone with evil intentions used as a weapon could no doubt kill many people without ever having to reload. Perhaps we should ban all those things because nobody really needs them.
That is a stupid argument because nobody is banning guns simply because you don't need them. They're banned because they are contributing to a fatal problem in society, and the fact that you don't need them means you have no good counter-argument. It's not, oh, you don't need this, so we're taking it away. It is, this thing is part of a growing problem, and you can't provide any coherent explanation why it should exist. And he's really preaching to the choir here. I'm the wrong guy to use this example on because I kind of agree. Nobody needs a 20-bedroom mansion or a private jet, and that owning these things do typically come at the expense of the rest of humanity. But he's engaged in a false equivalence. Nobody ever got shot because criminals broke into my home and stole my 20-bedroom mansion and then sold it on the black market. Owning a private jet may hurt the environment, but it's not directly killing people the way that mass shootings do. The samurai sword is another dumb argument because I've never heard of a mass stabbing anywhere near the scale of a mass shooting. It's also a lot easier to stop a melee attacker with a sword than a gunman. At least people have a fighting chance in that scenario. Plus, it's hard to conceal a samurai sword. If you walk around with one, you're gonna get questioned. They don't come with folding stocks and shit. But if functional swords were prohibited, I'd be okay with that too. Because realistically, nobody needs a battle-ready sword. You can get decorative ones, or ones blunted for tournament fighting, or an antique. But in the name of liberty, I think at this point we can keep them because we don't have a growing worldwide sword problem yet. People just want to show them off to their weeb friends. I like his BMW example though, because it brings me to another example. There will come a time in the near future when all cars are self-driving and run on clean energy. A computer will guide your vehicle on a grid and safely to your destination. Now imagine there's a lobby of people who insist that it's tyranny if you don't let them drive their manual steering gas-guzzling cars and potentially smash into people on the AI freeway. They would be considered insane. Yeah, it's kind of sad that people won't have the liberty to drive as they please or do donuts in a parking lot anymore, but you can't justify the 1.3 million vehicular deaths with the joy of driving donuts. The detriment far outweighs the benefit, especially when there's an alternative that doesn't have the detriment. And that's not to say that we should trade liberty for security, but there's a nuanced middle ground that takes into account the outcomes of actions. The liberty for you to drive your manual car on my AI highway is actually impeding my liberty and right to life when you negligently smash into my self-driving car. And even if you personally aren't the one who does it, if you don't have any regulations, theoretically someone else will.
Lastly, this ban will do little to nothing at all to make anybody any safer. The overwhelming majority of firearms-related deaths in this country are due to suicide. Is banning assault weapons going to somehow relieve the depression of these suicidal people, or restore the businesses they have lost, or resurrect loved ones that they have lost, or somehow alleviate their despair? No, it will not.
No, banning assault weapons will not stop suicides. Nobody ever suggested it would. The measure is to reduce mass shootings, kid. Firearms do make suicide a hell of a lot easier to do spur of the moment though, so there is that, thanks for bringing it up. Laws are meant to abate crimes. Nobody expects them to stop crimes. This is the same line of logic as, we have laws against murder, but people still murder, so why do we have a law? Like, it's so fucking dumb, I can barely wrap my head around it. Like, obviously the law isn't meant to resurrect people's dead loved ones, it's to prevent new dead loved ones. Not to appeal to emotion, but how many dead civilians is the acceptable amount? Understand that this isn't a solution, it's a measure. It's a pincer attack. On one end, you slow down the flow of illegal guns at the border, and on the other end, you confiscate all the illegal guns you find here. Eventually, you reduce the overall number in circulation. That doesn't mean that they all just vanish off the face of the earth. It just means that there's less available on the streets, and the price of those that are available on the black market increase, which in turn makes it harder to source and less affordable to crazy people.
The vast majority of firearm-related homicides in this country carried out with illegally possessed firearms sourced for the United States. How will banning firearms of law-abiding citizens, who statistically are less likely to commit a crime than the rest of the population, reduce the number of homicides carried out by thugs with illegal firearms, mainly from the States? Answer, it will not. Sincerely, Fakey McFakeKid.
Where does he think that illegal firearms come from? Does he think they just fall out of the sky? No, most illegal firearms started out as legal sales and eventually made their way to the black market. Sure, many come from the United States, but that's not an argument against preventing the local sources. And the police claim that more and more are being obtained domestically. Personally, looking at the numbers, it doesn't seem like there was much of a surge of any kind, as some have claimed, but the amount of domestically sourced illegal firearms traced is competitive to those traced from south of the border. We don't really have an effective method of preventing illegal sales, so confiscation from criminals combined with the voluntary buybacks from civilians is the best method of trying to reduce the availability from the back end. I like his weird made-up stat though, the claim that law-abiding citizens are statistically less likely to commit a crime than the rest of the population. It's funny to me because he says right in it that they are law-abiding citizens, and of course by definition someone described as law-abiding wouldn't be committing any crimes at all. But what I think he means is that people who own legal firearms are less likely to use them than people who don't, which is again a pretty strange assertion, because people who don't have guns at all are obviously going to have a hard time committing crimes with one. People who own and have access to firearms are more likely to use them in crimes of passion, which only makes sense since people tend to cool down if they have to buy a gun and wait through the background check. And again, I have to point out that the entire purpose of this is reduction. Even if 70% of the guns in, say, Toronto came from the United States, that would still mean 30% of them came from here, and that's something we can tackle. If we do what we can to stop the smugglers and destroy all the prohibited firearms that are confiscated, you will eventually see a reduction in the amount available. This may not do much to stop hardcore career criminals, but this definitely puts up a barrier to lone gunmen who don't have any connections. There are a lot of low-level thugs and mentally ill psychos in Canada that aren't a threat simply because they don't have the hookups or mental stability to obtain a firearm. If you walk up to a criminal and ask to buy a gun, you're just going to get robbed because he knows you have money and no gun. And the fact that legal firearms still exist on the streets doesn't mean that the measures aren't doing their job. There would be even more if we didn't do anything at all, which seems to be the conservative solution to all of this.